Bienvenidos a la sesión de adoradores de la Vía Láctea, nuestra galaxia favorita y sus alrededores. Yo me llamo Luis Aguilar, vengo de México. Quiero agradecer a todos nuestros anfitriones por esta maravillosa conferencia que han organizado. Yo solo tengo una pequeña queja, y es de que en el logotipo, bueno, primero pusieron el mapa al revés, pero bueno, eso se vale porque cualquier marco de referencia es válido. Lo que no se vale es que hayan cortado la parte donde yo vengo, que es la península de Baja California, que la última vez que yo averigüé todavía éramos parte de Latinoamérica. Por otra parte, incluyeron a Miami, que aunque oficialmente no es todavía Latinoamérica, yo creo que ya va para allá. Bueno, pero en fin. Vamos a empezar las charlas. Primero va a ser Enrico, ya saben, aviso cuando falten 5, 1 y luego ya cuando termino el tiempo. Enrico.
Muchas gracias. Con esto. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this talk, and thank you for the organizer to allow me to present my work. So we will not start with the Milky Way, but with something close. So I hope I don't bore you with this talk. So I will present today the beginning of my work on investigating the ionized interstellar medium NGC 253, a galaxy very close to the Milky Way, with the goal of understanding the process of ejection and reaccretion of gas and how it contributes to fueling the star formation process. It is a project that I'm carrying on with a lot of people, in particular from the FANGS collaboration. So let's start a little bit. We all know the galaxy are basically engines that transform gas into star, right? However, if we look at the star formation rates and the reservoir of gas typically present in galaxies, all the gas should be exhausted, transformed in star in a little bit of time, like 1 gigayears, sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more. However, if we look at star formation histories, we know that actually the star formation can go on for a longer time. This means that we need to refuel the gas reservoir, and we need to accrete gas. And this is something that is well known. There are several processes for doing that. The most common one are accretion from the intergalactic medium, or merging between galaxies with gas-rich companions, right? However, if we only have accretion, we have another problems. Like we will basically exhaust the global reservoir of gas in the whole universe. However, if we look at how the amount of star formed in the universe and the amount of gas, of H1 gas present in the universe change as a function of redshift, we see that yes, star increase and gas decrease. However, there is a significant difference in rates. Like the H1 gas diminish with a much lower amount with respect to how many stars are being formed in the universe. This means that there must be some kind of recycling of gas, so some gas that is first accreted into galaxies, and then is ejected back, is cooled down, and contributes to replenishing the global reservoir of gas. So putting together these two things, we have a scenario where we have like something like star formation of AGN, the process gas in galaxies, launch outflows that can like remove the gas from the disk of the galaxy and inject it back into the intergalactic medium. Here the gas cools down and mixes with the already present gas, and then once it's cooled, it can reaccrete back and provide fuel for the new generation of star or for new AGN activities, etc., etc. This, once again, is a very well-known process, and it is thought to be very important, especially in nearby galaxies. However, it is very difficult to observe. Why? There are some different signatures that we could observe from this, like in falling gas directly, or like how the H1 is shaped, their kinematics, like difference in the metallicity distribution of the disk of star-forming galaxies, or the turbulence. However, everything is very difficult to actually observe directly. In falling gas, we have some example, maybe in the Milky Way, some high velocity clouds that could be reconnected with this kind of accretion. But for the rest, like we need extremely detailed kinematics map, extremely detailed metallicity map that we still don't have for any galaxy outside of the Milky Way. So to try and solve and identify this thing and see how the accretion works in nearby galaxies, we decided to target this galaxy, NGC 253, which is a very famous galaxy. The sculpture is very close to us, 3.5 megaparsec, which is very good because we have a resolution that allows us to see all the details of the disk, to blend emission line region, to identify different components. It has a strong star formation, meaning that we have a lot of this region that we can observe in the disk and we can sample in order to understand all the properties of the gas. It has a powerful starburst, which is ejecting like a powerful outflow. You can see it in the X-ray. This yellow shadow is the shape of the outflow. And also like a lot of cold H1 gas that can reaccrete very fast into the disk. We also have a lot of ancillary data, ALMA and MIRCA, that can help us understand even further what's happening. And recently, we also got some JWST data that will complement very well the data that yesterday Alberto showed you of the nucleus of this galaxy. So what's missing is the ionized gas. How do we see the ionized gas? With MUSE. So we ask them, we obtain like 51 hours with MUSE in priority A that allows us to map the full galaxy. So 20 by 5 arc minutes, 100 MUSE pointing to archival and 98.1, which to my knowledge is the largest MUSE mosaic that have been observed so far because observations are finished, completed. And the first results like are this. Here we can see like tricolor image of the galaxy in a broadband filter, but we are actually interested in the gas. So if we isolate only the ionized gas, we see this. So we see that we have a lot of structure. We clearly see the outflow like in Alberto's images. We don't see the counter outflow from the other side, which is obscured, but still we have a pretty nice view. We see a lot of ionized nebula. They are the thing that we can use to trace the gas conditions. We see a lot of them are resolved, so it's relatively easy to distinguish between the different type of regions and their role in the ISM of the galaxy. And also we see a lot of structure in the ionized gas, in the diffuse ionized gas of the galaxy that can help us identify if we can see like flow of gas from the arms to outside or something like that. So the science is in very early stages. I'm still working on the data reduction. However, if you're interested in this, the data cubes and the high-level data products will be available publicly at some point, like for all Phanx galaxies. And also because these are very large, like a high legacy value. So there are plenty of things that people can do with this that I cannot even think of. But among that, we have already several projects going, some more strictly related to the reaccretion topic. For example, building an HU region catalog and studying the metallicity distribution of the ionized gas that can help us understand if there is gas reaccreting, or characterization of the supernova feedback, supernova location, how like they are the location where part of the gas could be ejected from the disk into the IGM. And also like something that is not strictly connected, but still important, like the recalibration of the galaxy distance using the planetary nebular luminosity function. Like just to talk a little bit about this HU region catalog, from preliminary tests, we get like around 6,500 nebula, just like from a rough, like very quick analysis of the H alpha map. These, of course, are not all HU regions, so there will be some cleaning, but we expect that to have around 6,000 HU region across the full galaxy, around 15 HU region per kiloparsec square, the projected, which means that we can have very detailed map of metallicity and ionized gas properties, which should be sufficient to study both large scale and small scale variation on the metallicity across the full disk. So this is very, very promising. Work in progress, of course. From the planetary nebular luminosity function side, this is a little bit more advanced. The reason for this is that last time that we did this kind of measurement was like 20 years ago, and they had only 14 nebula. Right now, again, just a rough look for planetary nebula revealed like around 390 candidates that will have to be cleaned. But so between 300 and 350 planetary nebula in this galaxy, we should allow us to have a better view of the luminosity function and of the distance of the galaxy. Unfortunately, the first results are not very promising. We have like 4.1 megaparsec, which is like half megaparsec away with respect to what's normally accepted for the galaxy. So there is still something that we have to understand if we like our measurement is correct or if we are still messing up a little bit the calibration and something like that. Yeah, exactly. But apparently no. And yes, this is a work in progress. Hopefully in the next few months we have something published. And with this, I finish. So like NGC 253 is a good target to study in gas accretion because we have a promising setup with all its properties. It's like we have it's easily observed by Muse, and we finally have the data. The mosaic is completed. We have a very beautiful data. We still are working on the science, but we have promising results, but we still need to do some work. And I leave you with this if you want to look at it a little bit more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico, for finishing on time. Any questions from the public? There are two over there.
Beautiful. So I wonder, these are line maps, right? So you measure the lines. So when you measure the line for each pixel, did you do the same thing that people do with IFU of smaller galaxies, which is remove a stellar population, fit all of that, or because I would be wondering, the spatial resolution here is so large compared to 20 megaparsec galaxy or something like that, that maybe those tools might not work so well as well as they do for distant galaxies.
Okay. This is like just some integration of a emission line on the spectrum, because we still have a problem with some emission line, H alpha in particular. Sky subtraction is messing up half of the galaxy. So that's I'm working on that. But the goal, yes, is to follow the same procedure that we follow with FANGS. So using PPXF to study stellar population and then fit in the line maps, etc., etc. And I already did a run. It works relatively well. It doesn't work very well in here in the center, because we have like the outflow and a lot of multiple emission line components. So that's a little bit that we'll have to work a little on it. I think Alberto is working on only on the first two archival pointing that are the central one. But yes, the goal is to have everything fitted, and it works. Takes time, like weeks.
Okay, there was a second question.
Thank you for the beautiful talk. I was wondering, what is the criteria that you're using to select the planetary nebula candidates, and what are the signatures that you're looking for? Okay, so we tried several approaches, like automatic detection with some like DAO-FOT or something like that. But this is so heavily resolved that we pick a lot of weird stuff. So what I've been doing, since it's just one galaxy, I'm doing the old-fashioned way, like blinking H alpha and oxygen 3. And I assure you that it's much faster than doing like a catalog with automatic tools and cleaning them like with further things. Of course, these are just candidates. We are using like the oxygen 3 H alpha ratio to try and clean up something like as a second step. But and checking that everything is unresolved as much as we can, like knowing the information on the PSF for each pointing, we can tell if something is kind of resolved or not. So this is the basic cleaning for selecting planetary nebula. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Enrico again. We're ready for the next speaker, Chebrin.
Yeah, that would probably help. All right, so thank you, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers for upgrading me to give a talk. So today I'll be talking about tracing dark matter halo wakes with stellar halos. This is work in progress. We'll still go through this together. So why stellar halos in the first place? Well, on this image, basically what I'm showing you is, an image of the Bullock and Johnston simulation of a galactic stellar halo. And on the right side, I'm showing an image of basically a galactic dark matter halo as seen in the dark matter. So, that's why there's the dark side from the Aquarius project from the Virgo Consortium. And what you can see is in this image is that, lambda CDM basically predicts a lot of substructure around galactic dark matter, around galaxies like the Milky Way, and particularly at very large distances, these predictions are fairly robust. Whereas when you look closer down to the inner region of the galaxy where baryons start to dominate, this is kind of the region where the predictions become less, more uncertain on sort of the number of surviving subhalos, etc. But so basically the best way to really trace, this distribution of dark matter on large galactic scales is basically, at least in the Milky Way, where we have full information of the 6D phase space information of every star, is by effectively studying the stellar halo. And what is the stellar halo? You can view it as sort of the trash can of the Milky Way, where basically all the accretion events that happens throughout its lifetime sort of somewhat remain encoded, out to very large radii where dynamical times are fairly long. And, this is basically a very small fraction of the total mass in the galaxy, yet it allows us to probe basically the distribution of dark matter on very large scales. And I will actually talk about some of the processes that we can even explore using those using stellar halos. And one of them is dynamical friction. Obviously, when galaxies merge, they merge basically through this process of dynamical friction, which basically makes your galaxy lose angular momentum, so it can effectively spiral towards your host galaxy. And in the Milky Way, we have a beautiful example with the Large Magellanic Clouds, which new proper motion measurements suggest that they are on the first infall orbit, and also sort of new mass measurements, for example, from time argument methods, show that basically the Magellanic Clouds are almost like a fourth of the total mass of the Milky Way. And it's been already acknowledged, right since the actually mid 80s, well, actually no, late 70s. There's a paper by Scott Tremaine and Martin Weinberg. But Martin basically further developed a better understanding of how dynamical friction works in spherical systems. And in this 1998 paper, he shows that, when you have a smaller satellite, orbiting a larger host, what it does is that it, through sort of resonant processes, it can basically create all sorts of distortions on various scales, from, sort of simple dipole distortions. That's just simply from the shift in the center of mass from the two systems, but also, for example, things like quadrupoles. And these, for example, quadrupoles can even penetrate all the way to the midplane of the galaxy and even tilt and warp your disk. So one of the things that's actually interesting is, well, what happens when a smaller galaxy merges with a larger one. And this is beautiful work led by Nico Garavito Camargo, in which basically what we did was run a set of simulations, self-gravitating, full n-body simulations of the interaction between a Milky Way like galaxy and an LMC. And in these two models, what we've only changed here is basically the internal kinematic distribution of the dark matter. So here it's basically a fully isotropic dark matter halo, and here this one is slightly anisotropic. And what you can see is the two salient things that that Martin predicted already through his linear perturbation theory models. So you have basically the transient response of the dark matter halo, which is classically known as sort of the Chandra-Sekhar wake, right? All these particles getting deflected behind the body, and effectively the sort of the global response, due to the sort of shift in the center of mass. So you have basically this collective response where you have an overdensity and larger underdensities. And this is only looking at the dark matter. Obviously, this is one way of looking at it, and we also made some predictions of what it would look like in the stellar halo, and people kind of got excited when Gaia came around, and started trying to look for this imprint for those predictions. This is a work by Vasily Belokurov, who I believe was one of the first studies to interpret this sort of Pisces overdensity as basically the transient response, or the classical Chandra-Sekhar wake, and mostly by looking at sort of, sorry, it's really hard to point, by looking at sort of this distance gradient along Pisces. And this was then taken further by Charlie Conroy's group, looking at K-giants when the early Gaia Deidos 3 release came, and they came up with sort of a map that sort of seems to look a little bit like what the simulations predict. I think one thing we need to be really careful is when we're looking at our Lyrae or even K-giants, is that they're very porous tracers of the stellar halo. You're really talking about like a few hundred stars. And we should also be very careful when, for example, smoothing the data and subtracting and not taking care of things like, for example, covering factions and filling factors of space. And so the other thing that we really need to take into account is that all the predictions that we've made with Nico were based on assuming a smooth stellar halo for the distribution of the stellar halo. But if you look at what you actually predict, from numerical simulations, you generally have 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. You generally have basically a very non-smooth structures when you look beyond 50 kiloparsecs. So this is like, so giving you a rough order of magnitude. Things are looking smooth-ish within 50 kiloparsecs, but as soon as you go out, there's nothing really smooth about it. You're really dominated by substructure. And so when you look at plots like this, you should really be alarmed when you see little bumps and blobs, because it's not really clear whether you're looking at the collective response or whether you're just basically looking at substructure along your line of sight. And so so we're trying to the best we can to try to effectively explore the stellar halo in the observational space, and that's actually work that's led by Nico Amarante. And what we do in this work, but these are not plots from Nico. These are not plots from Joao, but we're basically using blue horizontal branch stars as distant tracers of the stellar halo, because you can fairly easily select them using color cuts. And this is was first demonstrated, I believe, by Circo et al. In the U minus G, G minus R color diagram, and then further taken, like more studied further with Alice Deason. But it turns out that you don't necessarily need the U-band to separate blue horizontal branch stars from, for example, other contaminants like blue stragglers or white dwarfs. You can also do that, using the R minus C, G minus R color diagram. And this is what Joao is doing here, is that, he's basically building a probabilistic model to select, bona fide like blue horizontal branch stars in every pixel in the sky using the Decals survey, which has a fairly large covering fraction of the sky. And, this is kind of, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but this is kind of the map that you can start making, where you're basically trying to derive the density at every pixel on the map, and also taking into account things like volume filling fractions. And once you do that and you try to do the more careful exercise, you end up seeing that there's almost no sign for this collective response that's been advocated. So this is basically the density contrast in the Pisces over density, which is sort of commonly known as like this, Chandrasekhar wave. But if you look in the northern part of the sky, it seems to be almost like consistent, pretty much like with 0. So the next step to do is to try to do some simulations and also try to interpret, okay, well, what can we really observe if we had a realistic stellar halo? And so basically this is what we did with Nico. What we're doing here is that we're taking basically the Bullock and Johnston stellar halos that were simulated in fixed analytic potentials, but because there is actually a fairly easy description for the potential, which only consists of an NFW profile, Hörnquist bulge, and I don't know, like some kind of like Kuzmin disk, you can basically generate the self-gravitating potential in which these stellar halos were simulated in. And basically all you need to do is kind of like you do some sort of in vitro process where you inject your stellar halos inside this self-gravitating potential, n-body representation. And the nice thing about the Bullock and Johnston stellar halo simulation is that there's about 11 of them. And so you can stick 11 stellar halos in the same potential and then run this through by throwing an LMC at it. Obviously, the Bullock and Johnston potential is not exactly matching the Milky Way potential, but there's still stuff that you can actually learn from the general characteristics of what you would actually see if you were to observe this. So you run this on a supercomputer. This is where we ran it in Barcelona. It's a very beautiful supercomputer. I recommend people like visiting it if you ever try to come by Barcelona. So this is again the same plot that Nico kind of produced, where we're looking at the density contrast of dark matter. You can see that you want to isolate the collective response, and so the best thing to do is really to go towards much larger radii, something beyond like 80 kiloparsec or so, where you start really seeing the dipole response. And what you can actually see is that, in the case where there's no LMC, in the case where there is an LMC, there's basically, you have a large depreciation of stars in sort of this lower quadrant. And this is kind of seen over here, right? And despite, so these are slabs of mass density, with the LMC, without the LMC. You can clearly see that, if you go to very large radii, you should effectively be able to sort of detect this. Probably not in K-giants because it's almost like a Poisson process. But if you're going for example, main sequence turn-off stars, this is probably a signal that you might be able to see. And here's the corresponding kinematic signal, but I'm running out of time. And so what I want to do in those few seconds is to advertise the fact that we're a young group and we're looking for people to come and join us. And there's a number of postdoc fellowships that actually exist, including one in my group if you're interested. And also we have a number of PhD fellowships in Spain. So if any student is interested, please come and talk with me after the break. These are some of the projects we have on offer with me and Teresa, and also another doctoral school, EU doctoral school with Francesca Figueras. Yeah, we're a very friendly group, and we're a small workforce, but maybe there's a space for you in here, and I will leave it to my conclusions.
Thank you, Chervin. Very nice talk. Any questions? Questions, comments, complaints? There's one over here.
Thanks, Chervin. Yeah, so finding these true main sequence turn-off stars, I guess we'll have to wait for LSST. Yeah.
We will have to wait for LSST and probably LSST and Euclid right in the north.
So, oh yes, yeah.
But yeah, I think this is. But actually, I wouldn't jump to conclusions about waiting for main sequence turn-off stars because I think there is a talk. I think the last talk of the day was by someone looking at main sequence turn-off stars, the stellar halo main sequence turn-off stars. So I'm excited to hear about that talk. So,
yeah.
There was another question over there.
To wait for the SST.
Over there.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really good. You basically covered everything from right now. So my question is, when you do a comparison between your simulations and Nicolas simulations, those simulations are usually showing just dark matter. So how do you relate the dark matter content to the stellar content that can be unobservable, for example?
Yeah, well, that's something that we still need to work that out. I mean, we basically just ran those things. Actually, we ran those things a year ago, but I just didn't get time to go and look at them. So, I mean, I think what we need to first understand is star to star. So basically smooth stellar halo to stuff like this, like horrendously substructured and annoying, difficult stellar halos. And yeah, I mean, one thing that you can actually somewhat relate, it's not shown in this figure here, but I can probably show it to you afterwards, is that you can what I tried to do at some point here was to overlay the contours that you have in this image here back onto the stellar halo. And what's kind of interesting is that at least all the blue region basically follows all of this kind of thing pretty well. So so there's probably even ways of relating it even to extragalactic scales, for example. But yeah, this is something that I still need to think about. I haven't really thought about it that deeply.
Okay, let's move on to the next talk. Let's thank Chervin again. Now for the next talk, we're going to hear a little bit about the stellar streams made with RR Mateu stars.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming to this talk, for your patience with us this week. Voy a hablar en español para tratar un poco de fomentar la diversidad lingüística, pero me pueden preguntar en español o inglés, por favor, portugués, no entiendo nada. Yo por esta vez no voy a hablar de estrellas RR Lyra, pero luego hablamos, Chervin. Les voy a hablar un poco sobre el esfuerzo que he estado haciendo para mantener registro de mucha de la subestructura de la que Shervin ya un poco nos adelantó en su charla. Entonces voy a empezar con la definición muy básica de qué es lo que es una corriente estelar, que es lo que en inglés llamamos stellar streams o tidal streams. Y bueno, estas son estructuras que se forman, remanentes que se forman cuando una galaxia enana o un cúmulo globular está orbitando alrededor de nuestra galaxia y sus estrellas son arrancadas por las fuerzas de marea de la galaxia más masiva, al igual que las de, esto no afecta solamente a las estrellas, sino también la materia oscura. Déjenme hacer aquí que va más rápido. Sino también la materia oscura, y entonces eso produce estos remanentes, estas colas muy espectaculares, que, bueno, sobreviven más tiempo en el halo por los tiempos dinámicos largos, como ya lo mencionó Shervin, y por eso la búsqueda de corrientes estelares es mucho más favorable en el halo. Entonces, bueno, no solo por el hecho de que a nadie se puede resistir a mostrar alguna animación de la formación de una corriente estelar, nosotros estudiamos este tipo de estructura. Un poco por mi formación en poblaciones estelares del CIDE en Venezuela, yo lo relaciono con las poblaciones estelares de los cúmulos. Las corrientes estelares, los streams, son a la dinámica lo que los cúmulos estelares son a las poblaciones estelares, al estudio de la evolución de las poblaciones estelares. Son sistemas relativamente simples en los que las estrellas comparten un origen común. En el caso de los cúmulos, las estrellas tienen la misma, están a la misma distancia, tienen la misma edad, cuando son poblaciones estelares simples, y la misma metalicidad, y eso hace que las estrellas se distribuyan a lo largo de una isócrona en los diagramas color-magnitud, que, bueno, todos conocemos muy bien. En el caso de las corrientes estelares, bueno, las estrellas ahora ya no necesariamente comparten propiedades de su población estelar, sino más bien integrales de movimiento, como por ejemplo la energía, el momentum angular a lo largo de una dirección de simetría del potencial. Y en este caso, pues las estrellas se delinean, se distribuyen a lo largo de aproximadamente una órbita. Esto es la imagen de los isocontornos de la población estelar de la corriente estelar de PAL 5, de la que van a oír hablar más en unos minutos. Y bueno, la gracia es que estas propiedades comunes, tanto en el caso de los cúmulos como en el caso de los streams, nos permiten tanto encontrar estas estructuras en el halo y distinguirlas del fondo, como inferir propiedades de los propios sistemas que las produjeron, como de la Vía Láctea, que también pues es causante de este tipo de cosas. Entonces, bueno, ¿para qué utilizamos específicamente, para qué aplicaciones nos interesan las corrientes estelares? Bueno, primero porque son una evidente parte del registro fósil del proceso de acreción de nuestra galaxia. Ahí están, son remanentes de cosas que se ha ido tragando la Vía Láctea, parte, no todo, y bueno, pues van a ser algunos de los bloquecitos que van a ayudarnos a idealmente reconstruir un gráfico de este estilo de masa contra el tiempo de acreción, que es lo que llamamos la historia de acreción de la Vía Láctea, lo que es una meta extremadamente ambiciosa que, bueno, se espera lograr de manera colectiva, no por ningún grupo individual seguramente. Luego también hay otras aplicaciones como el ajuste de órbitas, con el cual se puede hacer inferencia del potencial, inferir cómo es el potencial de la Vía Láctea en el que se producen los streams, su forma, la masa total, cómo está distribuida esa masa gravitatoria. Se puede también ahora, ya con las medidas muy precisas que tenemos, modelar subestructura, perfil de densidad a lo largo de los streams. Se pueden detectar un montón de pequeñas perturbaciones. Esto se pudo hacer gracias a Gaia DR2, es el stream GD1, en el cual se ven, espero yo que evidentes, brechas o gaps en la densidad. Estos no son efectos, no son sesgos observacionales. Se ve también cositas como el spore, pequeñas ramas secundarias. Y bueno, el modelado de todos estos efectos pues nos permite inferir la masa inicial del progenitor, su configuración, e incluso poner constraints a la distribución de materia oscura de subhalos que puedan ser responsables de causar este tipo de perturbaciones en streams muy delgados. Así que hay muchas razones para querer estudiar este tipo de cosas. Ahora, ¿Cuántos de ellos conocemos en la Vía Láctea? Bueno, la respuesta más reciente es casi del orden de un centenar. Esto, bueno, es el primer gráfico de mi artículo de este año en el que, bueno, he hecho una revisión de la literatura tratando de poner un poco de orden en 20 años de detección 25 ya años de detección de corrientes estelares. Aquí seguramente los que conocen de streams estarán buscando su stream favorito. Suerte con eso. Les menciono nada más que este violeta que está aquí es Sagitario, del que ya mencionó un poquito Shervin hace un minuto. Entonces se pueden imaginar que en 25 años desde la detección del primero, que fue el de Sagitario en el año 95, pues esto ha evolucionado de una manera muy, llamémoslo, orgánica. La forma de reportar los streams es muy variada, desde un track hasta más recientemente listas de estrellas miembro de streams, pero a veces es simplemente pues remarcar en qué pedazo de una imagen está el stream. Entonces la idea de esta biblioteca fue hacer una compilación uniforme y volver más fácil la comparación de las detecciones nuevas contra las cosas conocidas y sobre todo que saber qué es lo que hay es el primer paso indispensable para hacer cualquier tipo de búsqueda automatizada. Entonces, con la cual luego se puedan hacer estudios estadísticos. Entonces, ¿qué es la biblioteca Gulfstreams? Bueno, es un inventario de tracks del cielo, distancia, movimiento propio y velocidad radial para 95 streams compilados en 125 tracks, porque hay más de un track puede haber más de un track para el mismo stream. ¿Y qué es un track? Bueno, simplemente un arreglo, un vector de posición contra un ángulo o de distancia contra ángulo, movimiento propio y en cualquiera de las dos coordenadas contra el ángulo. Como esto está basado en AstroPy, en realidad el sistema de coordenadas es el que ustedes quieran. Esto se puede cambiar de sistema de coordenadas. Antes de que me olvide, esto está todo disponible en un paquete de Python que es público, que incluye también, bueno, cambios de coordenadas de stream frames, los momentos angulares, polos, etc. Esto sería como se ve el mismo stream orphan, el que estaba mostrando, en el sistema de coordenadas natural del stream en el plano medio de su órbita. ¿Qué no es Gulfstreams? Lo que todo el mundo quiere, que es una base de datos con miembros estelares a las que le puedan hacer follow-up. Eso no es. Eso no es porque no existe, no se puede hacer, y para poderlo hacer necesitas esto, que es menos, pero bueno, es lo que lo necesitas para empezar. Y esto lo voy a comentar un poco más en las conclusiones. Entonces, por ejemplo, si uno tiene un pedazo de cielo y qué streams aparecen ahí, bueno, este es el caso del pedazo de cielo de PAL 5. Ustedes pueden ver que todos estos streams pasan por esa parte del cielo, verlos como en distancia se empiezan ya a diferenciar y se empiezan a diferenciar aún más en movimiento propio gracias a, ¿quién? Gaia, por supuesto. Un par de resultados muy breves, porque todavía no me han mostrado el último cartel, así que creo que tengo tiempo. ¿Qué tienen los streams en la literatura? Bueno, tienen los tracks, la mayoría empíricos derivados para la mayoría de los 80% de los streams. Sorprendentemente, casi la mitad de los streams solamente tienen una distancia promedio. Poder medir empíricamente la distancia a lo largo del stream es crítico para poder hacer ajustes de órbitas. Entonces, parece que no, pero bueno, esto es una cosa que es importante completar para la casi mitad, 40 y tantos streams que no lo tienen. 62% de streams tienen movimientos propios. A mí me sorprendió, pero después dije, no, claro. 2/3 partes son más los streams que tienen movimiento propio que los que tienen distancia. Así que, bueno, gracias, Gaia, otra vez. Pueden mirar también, por ejemplo, biases muy evidentes, como el hecho de que los streams fotométricos favorecen la detección, los métodos fotométricos favorecen detección de streams lejanos y los cinemáticos la detección de streams cercanos. Así que este gap aquí es un evidente sesgo observacional, y si usted quiere detectar una corriente estelar, vaya y búsquela entre 10 y 15 kiloparsecs, porque ese gap no es una cosa real, eso es una cosa netamente observacional. Y también se pueden hacer cosas como la detección de la desalineación de los movimientos propios las estrellas, como en un stream deberían seguir más o menos una órbita, pues sus movimientos propios deberían ser tangentes a la órbita, al propio stream. Y ya se han encontrado varios streams, este es el de Orphan, en los cuales eso no pasa, están desalineados los movimientos propios con la órbita, también se ha observado en otros de los streams de DES. Esto es algo que en Gulfstreams pueden ver ahora ya alrededor de mostrar, hacer un mapa del Proper Motion Misalignment en el cielo. Y bueno, para no dar mal ejemplo, los dejo aquí con mi lámina de conclusiones, utilizando, bueno, Gulfstreams y un grupo muy grande de gente, nos hemos reunido en una colaboración en la que estamos haciendo, pues la idea es tratar de hacer una búsqueda de todos los miembros de todos los streams conocidos, y estamos ya preparando un primer paper con 5 streams prototípicos para liberar el pipeline y que cualquiera lo pueda utilizar. Así que pretendemos rellenar esto muy pronto y bueno, muchas gracias. Los dejo aquí con la conclusión.
Muchas gracias, Cecilia. Así que ahora tenemos no solo bibliotecas de estrellas y de nebulosas planetarias, sino también tenemos bibliotecas de espaguetis. ¿Preguntas o comentarios? A ver, aquí hay una pregunta en medio. Y luego había una segunda pregunta atrás, ¿verdad?
Bueno, muchas gracias por tu charla, estuvo muy interesante. Quería saber si en este catálogo, bueno, entendí que hay que considerar la energía y el momento angular que tienen estos streams. ¿La forma en la que se calcularon fue heterogénea? O sea, homogénea en este caso, por ejemplo, los potenciales que utilizaron.
No. A ver, justamente lo que no es Gulfstreams es algo homogéneo, porque es una recopilación de la muy heterogénea literatura. Así que absolutamente no. Lo que vamos a hacer ahora no tiene ninguna clase, lo que estamos haciendo en CATS, no tiene ninguna clase de modelado ni de suposición sobre la dinámica, sino que es un modelo probabilístico de, bueno, de la densidad y de que tiene que ver con correlaciones entre los movimientos propios como función de un ángulo, pero sin imponer ningún modelo de potencial ni nada de ese estilo.
Perfecto.
Sí.
Vamos con la segunda pregunta allá atrás.
Cecilia, enorme trabajo. Quería preguntarte, cuando mostraste el histograma de el logaritmo de la masa contra el tiempo, digamos, ¿eso podés dar un poquito más de detalles cómo lo construís? ¿Es masa estelar y acreción, digamos?
Sí, esto era una caricatura. Totalmente, no me crean nada.
Okay.
Sí, no lo dije porque vamos.
Era esquemático.
Sí, totalmente esquemático. Algún día quisiéramos llegar a algo así. Sí, algo así.
Había una tercera pregunta por acá.
Hola, gracias. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué tan completo uno podría considerar que son los largos, la longitud de los Galaxy Stream que uno está haciendo? Por ejemplo, si uno tiene un campo, puede testear si un stream pasa ahí, ¿qué tan confiable es la longitud que es?
No es en absoluto confiable porque eso está muy determinado por los footprints de los sondeos fotométricos con los cuales se detectaron. De hecho, en el caso de Orphan, bueno, si lo busco ahora no lo voy a encontrar, tengo como 30 diapositivas de repuesto, pero en el caso de Orphan lo que pasó es que ¿dónde estaba más adelante? Orphan se había detectado en el norte y había todo un gap cerca de donde está el disco, y gracias a Gaia de R2 con estrellas RR Lyras se encontró que aquí había un pedacito que había sido detectado por DES que se llamó Chenab, que de hecho en este gráfico de Ship et al, Chenab está por aquí, creo que es este pedacito así. Este pedacito ellos lo llamaron Chenab porque creyeron que era un stream diferente, porque Orphan estaba por allá en la parte norte, y con las RR Lyras de Gaia de R2 se pudo ver que todo es el mismo stream. Eso seguramente está pasando, sabemos que está pasando en otros, por ejemplo, M68 Fjorm, NGC, no me acuerdo quién, 3201 y Gyol, hay como 4 o 5 en los que ya se ha encontrado que un pedazo de un lado correspondía con otro pedazo de otro lado. Y una de las razones para hacer esta compilación es empezar a tratar de ver cuántas de las cosas que conocemos están vinculadas entre sí.
Ok, y creo que hay una pregunta implícita de Cecilia hacia Anthony, hacia ¿cuándo sale el próximo Gaia ADR?
Take your
Bueno.
time. Tómense su tiempo, son tantos datos que...
Agradezcamos a Cecilia una vez más.
Gracias.
Vamos con la siguiente plática.
Oli. Bueno, hola, ¿todo bien? Bueno, yo soy Bruno Domínguez, soy estudiante de maestría. Estoy terminando actualmente mi primer año. Mis tutores son Cecilia Mateu que acaba de hablar, y Pau Ramos. Y hoy le voy a mostrar algunos resultados que he tenido hasta ahora en esta charla titulada Censo sistemático de R liras en cúmulos versus colas de cúmulos globulares, perdón, de corrientes estelares con un cúmulo asociado. Entonces, primero voy a empezar describiendo brevemente los objetos de estudio, arrancando por las RR liras. Estas son canteras estándares, por lo tanto se puede calcular su distancia de forma muy precisa. Son estrellas pulsantes que viven en la rama horizontal del diagrama HR. Básicamente, principalmente hay dos tipos, las RRAB, que son aquellas que pulsan en su modo fundamental, se puede ver este blob en el diagrama de amplitud periodo, y las tipo C, que son las que pulsan en su primer modo fundamental. Perdón, al revés. Las AB en el modo fundamental y la C en el primer modo excitado. Son estrellas de baja masa evolucionadas, de alrededor 0,8 masas solares, y son canónicamente viejas, de mayor a 10 gigaños, por lo tanto son buenas para trazar poblaciones viejas. Y para tener un nudo a la cabeza, hay alrededor de una RR lira cada 10 a 4 masas solares. Bueno, el otro objeto de estudio, que Cecilia ya lo definió, son las corrientes estelares. Entonces simplemente le voy a contar un poquito sobre la simulación, que lo que muestra es una simulación de spread particles, que dado un potencial de la Vía Láctea, muestra cómo se van formando diferentes corrientes estelares, dado la posición, velocidad y masa hoy de en particular, 5 cúmulos globulares reales. Entonces ahí se va viendo cómo a medida que va pasando el tiempo, la corriente estelar se va formando. Un poco más de lo que Cecilia ya habló, hoy en día hay alrededor de 100 corrientes estelares encontradas, pero solamente hay 16 más Sagitario, que está por fuera del estudio que tienen hoy en día un progenitor vivo. Luego solamente hay 8 más Sagitario que tienen R liras encontradas, y hacemos la intersección, solamente hay 1 PAL 5 más Sagitario con progenitor vivo y R liras encontradas. Bien, bueno, ¿por qué es útil buscar R liras en las corrientes estelares? El objetivo es hacer un censo sistemático en todas las de R liras, en todas las corrientes estelares, pero vamos a empezar solamente por aquellos que tienen un progenitor vivo. ¿Por qué? Porque como antecedentes, en Princeville and Mateu 2019, encontraron que en PAL 5 hay una relación de 17 a 10 R liras en colas versus el cúmulo, que implica o sea, que las colas son alrededor de 2,5 veces más masivas que el cúmulo. Además, algo bastante raro es que encontraron que las R liras del stream están segregadas. Es decir, que las de tipo AB, la mayoría de las AB están en las colas, que estas son las que son un poquito más masivas, y las tipo C se encuentran en la mayoría en el cúmulo, lo cual dinámicamente es extraño, porque dinámicamente uno esperaría que las cosas menos masivas son las que primero se escapan. Y acá está pasando lo contrario. Las menos masivas están en el cúmulo. Y bueno, de vuelta, repitiendo un poco lo que dijo Cecilia, bueno, solo hay alrededor de 50% de strings que tienen un track de distancias empírico. Por lo tanto, encontrar miembros encontrar RLIs a corrientes estelares es útil para poder aumentar este porcentaje, ya que su distancia se conoce de forma muy precisa. ¿Cómo hacemos esto? ¿Cómo encontramos RR-liras? Bueno, primero los datos que usamos es una unión de catálogos de RR-liras de Gaia R3, Panstar, ASAS, ZTF y OGLE, que son los catálogos de RR-liras más grandes y completos que hay hoy en día. Y además tomamos como verdaderos los tracks en cielo, distancia y movimiento propio de la galería de Gastrin, que bueno, acá ya pueden ir viendo que lo estoy representando como estas curvas negras. Ahora explico un poco más ese diagrama. Luego, como modelo probabilístico, se hace que cada estrella tiene una probabilidad de pertenecer a la corriente más una probabilidad de pertenecer al fondo, donde estas probabilidades dependen de la distancia y de los movimientos propios en el sistema de referencia del string Φ1, Φ2, donde el sistema este, como decía Cecilia, es un sistema esférico rotado, alineado al string, donde Φ1 crece con la corriente estelar y Φ2 es perpendicular al plano de la corriente. Luego, la probabilidad de membresía se calcula como la probabilidad de pertenecer al string dividido la probabilidad total. Y si esto es mayor al 50%, ahí va, y la estrella se encuentra a menos de 3 sigmas del track en el cielo, se toma como miembro, donde sigma es el ancho en el cielo calculado a partir de los miembros ya reportados en la literatura. Donde recuerden que en solo el caso de Pal 5 y Sagitario hay RR-liras. O sea, esto es otros miembros que no son RR-liras. Bien. Y bueno, ¿y qué encontramos? Encontramos que de los 16 cúmulos que estamos estudiando, string con cúmulos que estamos estudiando, solamente 6 presentan un número relevante de RR-liras en las colas. Luego hay 4 que presentan 1 o 2 RR-liras en las colas, otros 4 que solo en el cúmulo globular, 2 que no presentan nada y 6 donde vale la pena hacer este estudio, pero sin asumir los tracks como verdaderos, o sea, calcular nosotros mismos, ya que presentan desfasajes entre por dónde pasa el track y dónde está el progenitor. En particular, ahora nos vamos a concentrar en estos tres, NGC 2808, M92 y Tucana, para mostrar un poco los resultados. Arrancando por Tucana 3. Tucana es una galaxia ultra faint de 800 luminosidades solares y 0,8 por eso la 3 masas solares, la masa estelar. Y acá en particular, de vuelta, acá explicando un poquito más, lo negro es el track que está reportado en Gastrim, lo verde punteado simplemente es una extrapolación. La estrella azul es donde está el progenitor y los círculos rojos son los que encontramos como miembros. Y como ven, ahora voy a mostrar una imagen más clara, en el progenitor, en este caso Tucana, no hay ninguna RR-lira, sino que están todas en las colas. Entonces, esto indica un par de cosas, como que, bueno, el número nos puede decir cuánta masa ya ha perdido esta galaxia enana, que estimando 5 RR-liras equivaldría a 5 por 10 a la 4 masas solares. Sin embargo, en el paper de SHIP 2018, ella encuentra de que una masa estelar en las colas de 3,8 por 10 a la 3, por lo tanto, podría levemente implicar, esto podría significar que esa masa podría estar subestimada. No digo que sea verdad, pero podría. Ahora, en particular, viendo acá, este es de vuelta la corriente en el cielo, la línea acá punteada es simplemente el radio tidial, simplemente delimitando los límites del progenitor. De vuelta, acá muestro de que no hay nada en el cúmulo, sino que están todas las colas. Los rojos son las RR-liras tipo AB. Topando acá, perdón. Las naranjas son las tipo C, que acá de vuelta lo pueden confirmar en el diagrama amplitud-magnitud, donde hemos dicho que acá era el blob de las tipo C, el locus de la tipo C, y acá el locus de las tipo AB. Y luego la forma es estrella, es que está en la cola, y circulito, que acá no hay ninguna, es que está en el cúmulo. Bueno, y además, esto que no haya ninguna en el cúmulo puede implicar de que a Tucana 3 le falta un poco tiempo para que se termine de desarmar. Que tipo, se muera, queda solo corriente. Bien. Ahora, pasando al otro que había mencionado, a 2808. Acá, solamente con el track que está reportado en Gulfstream, encontramos 10 miembros, pero fíjense de que particularmente en movimiento propio, el track está desfasado del clúster, tipo, no pasa por ahí. Sin embargo, si ahí prestan atención, capaz que no tienen el ojo muy acostumbrado, pero acá se ve como una sobrensidad, por así decirlo, de RR-liras que quieren ser miembros. Entonces, esto es uno de los ejemplos que he mencionado donde valdría la pena hacerlo a ciegas sin asumir el track. De todas maneras, y simplemente para ver qué pasa, movemos esto manualmente, hacemos un offset para que el track pase por el cúmulo globular. Pasamos de encontrar 10 miembros a 29. Por lo tanto, definitivamente vale la pena hacer el estudio a ciegas, o sea, sin asumir los tracks. Ahora, pasando de vuelta, bueno, acá de nuevo, estas son las que se encuentran en el cúmulo, que son 7 RR liras y hay 22 en las colas. Y viendo el diagrama amplitud-magnitud, es bastante estándar, no se ve nada extraño, ningún tipo de segregación como la que se encuentra en PAL5, que era lo que estábamos buscando, a ver si eso ocurría. Eso no lo mencioné. Las antecedentes era, ok, PAL5 es extraño, vamos a ver si esto pasa en todas las corrientes estelares o es algo particular de PAL5. Acá vemos que particularmente en Tucana no había nada para comparar porque no había cosas en el cúmulo, y acá, bueno, no hay nada extraño. Em, y las herrerías en el clúster y en la cola presentan propiedades similares. Bien, y ahora pasando a M92, acá directamente con el track que está en Gaster encontramos bastantes RR liras, 29. Y si pasamos directamente al diagrama de amplitud-magnitud, vemos que no hay una segregación por tipo, o sea, como ven, acá hay 13 en el cúmulo, 10 AB, 3C, y en las colas son 16, donde son 13 AB y 13C, pero no sé si llegan a distinguir en que hay otro tipo de segregación en el que todas no, la mayoría de las colas están en esta parte del diagrama y las del cúmulo están en esta otra. Ahora, si saben de RR liras, les diría de que las que están en la cola son del tipo Osterhoff 1 y las que están en el cúmulo son de Osterhoff tipo 2. Si no son de RR liras, no importa, simplemente, esto implica simplemente de que las que están en el cúmulo tienen un periodo más grande. Y ahora, bueno, ¿por qué? De los escenarios que discutimos, el más plausible que encontramos es que la metalicidad de las colas es mayor a la del cúmulo. Esto además lo podemos decir porque las herreriras de las colas caen en el locus de estrellas con metalicidad de -1,5 y las del cúmulo en las de -2,2. O sea, en este diagrama la metalicidad aumenta hacia la izquierda. Además, esto está soportado por dos cosas. Una, en que la metalicidad la metalicidad del cúmulo medida espectroscópicamente es de -2,3, por lo tanto esto es consistente. Y además, si miramos la metalicidad medida espectroscópicamente de las estrellas, también vemos que las del cúmulo son menos metálicas que las de las colas. Bueno, ¿qué implica esto? Uno, que la población es mixta, por lo tanto, no puede ser un cúmulo globular. Después, bueno, la pregunta es, bueno, una galaxia, pero las galaxias tienen un gradiente de distancia, de metalicidad, perdón, pero cuanto más adentro está, más ricas son las estrellas, metales. Y acá lo que observamos es lo opuesto, por lo tanto, tampoco. Entonces lo que planteamos es que el cúmulo, M92 es el cúmulo y las colas son su galaxia enana anfitriona desarmada. Y además en promedio esto está soportado porque podemos decir que en promedio las galaxias a mayor masa, mayor metallicidad, y bueno, una galaxia enana es mayor que masa que un cúmulo. Y para terminar, concluyendo, después de hacer todo este censo sistemático, solo encontramos 6 de los 16 strings con un número relevante de raridades en las colas. Eso significa que estos son los que realmente vale la pena después hacerlo a ciegas, para hacer un estudio probabilístico más profundo. Y además sumar 3 más que vale la pena debido a que los tracks en distancia están desfasados de donde está el cúmulo globular. Y luego para el tema de la segregación, de los 6 estos que presentan varias RR liras, solo M92 presentó una segregación, pero no como del tipo que estábamos buscando, que era por tipo, como PAL5, sino espacialmente en RR liras diferente en colas versus cluster, donde, bueno, lo que ya dije, el más plausible escenario que encontramos es, bueno, el cúmulo por un lado y las colas, la galaxia enana satélite desarmada. Gracias. No, dejo acá.
Gracias, Bruno. Tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas. A ver, hay una allá.
Muy interesante la charla. Muy buena. Una pregunta, ¿qué otro tipo por ejemplo, de estrellas también tú encuentras en el cluster versus en Tails? Por ejemplo, ¿hay esta metalicidad o esta historia puede afectar el número de binarias de rayo X que tú ves en los streams o en las...
No
¿Tú
sé.
sabes algo de
O sea, solo estuve buscando RR liras y en realidad no sé. O sea,
No, y cómo tú, o sea, el clúster está bien, ¿cómo tú deal with the crowding en el centro del clúster?
Sí, no, o sea,
¿Qué están dentro del clúster? ¿Están las RR ligas? ¿Están bien en el centro?
o sea, la información, Cecilia, corregime, pero o sea, el cúmulo, o sea, hasta hace poco la parte que estaba dentro del crowding no estaba muy poblada. O sea, los catálogos son muy completos, o sea, lo que hay es lo que hay, no es que falta cosas, pero adentro del cúmulo, debido al crowding puede que no haya cosas. Hasta hace un poco salió un release de Gaia donde mejoraba esto, pero todavía no lo tuvimos en cuenta.
Ok, ¿alguna otra pregunta? Sí, allá.
Bruno, ¿uno esperaría algún tipo, o vos probaste, por ejemplo, de diferencias capaz que de segundo orden entre el leading y el trailing tails?
¿En qué sentido?
Bueno, mostraste, ¿no es cierto?, que tenías diferencias en metalicidades y en
Ok.
propiedades, digamos, ¿vale la pena?
A priori no, pero no creo que haya una diferencia muy circunstancial. Se podría probar, pero a priori no esperaría encontrar algo muy diferente.
No sabrás hasta que investigues. Bueno, es tiempo de movernos a la siguiente charla. Gracias.
Gracias.
Bruno. Muy bien.
Yeah, okay. So hello everyone. Thank you for being a Milky Way fan and being here today. So I will present the first half of my PhD thesis work that is called the Red Clump of Stars, so unraveling law towards the nuclear bulge of the Milky Way. So first, I want you to look at this fantastic artistic impression of what we think the Milky Way looks like today. And when we look at the very center of the Milky Way, of course, we know it's the bulge, but in this artistic impression, there's some kind of substructure here. We see dust lanes that goes along the bar and something disky in the very center. I'll finish up my talk really happy if you go out of this room knowing what it says and why you should care about it. So can we see it? Yes, of course, but not like that because we are in the Milky Way. So we have to look through the disk and observe through the dust and gas that is in it. So if we zoom in and we go to visible wavelengths, we basically see nothing, right? But once we turn on our infrared eyes, we observe that in this region, some magic appears and a lot of stars and dust and structure appears. This is what we call the nuclear bulge. So just for concepts, the Milky Way bulge is the entire structure, whereas the nuclear bulge that I will talk today is only this region, it's only a few hundred parsecs in radii. So the nuclear bulge has a structure, as I said, and has gas phase and stars in it. The gas phase is often called the central molecular zone. There are all these names in here, Sagittarius B1, the brick, etc. But I will refer today to the stars. In the stars, we have mainly two subgroups. First is the clusters. We have some massive clusters like Arceus and Quintuplet, and also the nuclear star cluster that is surrounding the Sagittarius A star. And also we have the nuclear stellar disk that is solidary, is coexisting with the central molecular zone here. So again, the nuclear bulge is not the Milky Way bulge, it's pretty different. So why? Because first, it's really much denser, a lot denser in star counts. Also contains gas, whereas the rest of the Milky Way bulge is mostly depleted of it, and therefore the populations are different. And because there's gas here, we have a current star formation, whereas the rest of the bulge we think is mainly old. So does the nuclear bulge tell us something about the entire assembly history of the Milky Way? And the answer is yes. We can learn something really cool about it. So let's think about this galaxy. This galaxy, once the disk is settled, we think the bar forms shortly after the disk is settled. So once the potential of a bar appears, what happens is that the potential is not axisymmetric anymore, so it produces torques in the gas in the disk. This gas funnels along the bar, and once it reaches its center, it forms nuclear structures that we were observing here, such as rings and clusters and disks. The issue is that this process is short. It's only about 100 megayears. So we can have an estimation of the epoch of formation of the bar of any galaxy, particularly of the Milky Way, if we can date the oldest stars that were formed in the center in the nuclear stellar disk, which is pretty cool if you ask me. This idea is not new. In fact, there's a project called the Timer Project that have done this with Muse and external galaxy. It's pretty cool. I invite you to look at it. And I'm attempting to compute the star formation history using the colored magnitude diagrams for these guys. So I hope that I convinced you that the nuclear bulge of the Milky Way is pretty cool. And now I will tell you what we can learn about it using red clumped stars, and particularly that I need to de-redden these stars in order to work with them. So just 3 words about red clumped stars. They are low mass helium burning core stars, which means, and they are a remarkable feature in the color magnitude diagram. And they vary very little with age and metallicity, which means that they are sort of a standard candle. We can use it to trace galactic structure. People have been doing this for a while. The bar of the Milky Way has been traced using red clump stars, and also they've been used in external galaxies as the LMC. I want you to look at the spread here. So the red clump should be a clump, a ball, but here is like spreaded along one line. And as you can see, it's spread along the reddening vector. So also we can use the red clump to learn about something about how the reddening works. Assuming, of course, that they are all about at the same distance. Are there observations in the nuclear bulge? Of course, there is, mainly in the millimeter and submillimeter. And there are only a handful of studies in the stars. Why? Because it's extremely difficult. As I said, we need to go to the near infrared, it's highly crowded, and the extinction is extreme, about 30 magnitudes in the visible, which is crazy. But there's a few observations. One of them that I have to mention is the ESO public survey called Galactic Nucleus, where they use Hawkeye at the VLT. And this is a near-infrared imager. They use the speculography technique where they get really, really sharp images. And well, they computed a star formation history of this region using the luminosity function. In my thesis, I want to use a different data set. So the galactic nucleus paw print are these white contours, but I'm using these blue contours here that we use also Hawkeye, but in a much more traditional way. We didn't use this speculography technique, and we use a ground layer adaptive optics to get really sharp images, and then we produce the photometry catalogs, and we get a full width half maximum of 0.3 arcseconds. If this number means nothing to you, I want you to compare this image. This is TUMAS. This is 3 arcseconds PSF, so it's really wide, it's really big. Then we go to BBB survey, which is 0.7 approximately, and then we go to 0.3. So this is a really good improvement, I think. And then I took these images, and I perform the photometry, and these are the color magnitude diagrams that we get for each field that I showed you before. And as you can see, the red clump, they're really messy, but the red clump is outstanding, it appears. So the red clump, the extinction is evident, right? There's nothing to do with it. So what can we learn from the red clump stars? We can say, okay, what people has been doing is that we compute the slope here, and we can use that to de-redden the stars. But the issue is that here there's a disk. So we cannot assume that all of the stars are at the exact same distance. In fact, the spread of distance could be really important. So we need to constrain, at the same time, the reddening law plus the distribution of stars along the line of sight. And how do we do that? Oh, and just to compare, this is the BBB. This is the stars in the BBB, and just to compare the color magnitude diagrams. How do we do that? So stick with me for a second. Red clump stars absolute magnitude is really well known. It's really well constrained. So we can place the red clump at 8.2 kiloparsecs. And when we do that, we can use that as an anchor right here. So we know that this is the position that the red clump should occupy if there's no extinction at all. So now we use different extinction laws that are in the literatures, some of the Alonso Garcia that is right here, and some others. And we put the extinction law as a line here. So we know that a star that is located at 8.2 kiloparsecs with that reddening should be on top of that line. If the star is closer to us, it's brighter. If the star is further away from us, it's dimmer. So this means that this is an anchor, and this moves like this, up and down. And this produces different distributions of stars along the line of sight. And when we do that, we have this, for example, here's the 8.2 kiloparsecs, the distance to the galactic center. And some of the extinction laws produces stars that are, the peak of the stars are in front of us, in front of the galactic center. But we know that there's a disk, and we have no prior to assume that we should have a peak at 7 kiloparsecs. We know that the peak should be at 8.2. And we look for the slope that give us that. In fact, you see that there's a reddening that fairly produces it really well. And what we find is that this is a number. So the issue is, most of the extinction laws here that didn't take into account the existence of the disk and produce an overestimation of the extinction. And particularly for this region, this is really critical, because if I want to compute the star formation history, I need to de-redden this stuff. And any variation in the extinction will affect the output of the extinction law in the star formation history, sorry. So how does this slope compare with the slope of the red clump? I computed the slope of the red clump. I don't have time to talk about this slope here. So just look at the blue one. So it's 1.4. And once we place this slope that give us the distribution that peaks at 2, we see that some of the stars are placed. Some of the stars here are brighter. So we think that the less reddened stars that are bluer are brighter because they're closer to us, whereas the stars that are more reddened because they're on the other side of the nuclear stellar disk are more reddened, and therefore they're dimmer because they're further away. Okay, so I'm just finishing. So the summary and near future work. Working with the nuclear biology is pretty cool, but it's also pretty challenging. We need to be careful when we use red clump stars, when we have some kind of substructure, and we need to take into account of it, because we can mess up the extinction loss we derive. Also, differential extinction is an issue. So each pointing has a lot of differential extinction. We are working on it and how to homogenize this. The photometric calibration also is really critical, because little variations in the 0 points we apply to the photometric catalog can induce some errors here. So we're double checking that the calibration is really accurate. And finally, we need to compute the star formation history using the color magnitude diagrams. And of course, we need to fully understand how the extinction affect those and incorporate that into the synthetics in order to recover accurate histories and therefore ages. And therefore, we would have a prior information of when they were formed. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I have to add yet another component for the model of our galaxy. There's a question over here.
Yes, cool stuff. So you were assuming 8.2 kiloparsecs, but I thought,
Yes.
I mean, there might be no reason why they couldn't be asymmetric or offset, etc., from the
Yeah,
central region.
that's a good question. I'm assuming
Do you-
gravity.
Well, I'm just wondering if do you have enough information to try to infer the distance distribution together with your extinction to let the 8.2 kiloparsecs free as a
No, I'm
parameter?
using the prior information that gravity gave us, like the distance to the galactic.
Yes, the distance to the galactic center, I understand, but
Exactly.
the distribution of the red clump stars itself maybe is not symmetric about.
Yes, I've been
right?
asked that before. Yes, of course. Probably it could be that the peak, it could be like closer if we are lacking completeness further away. But we are in the infrared. We get really complete at this level. In fact, I computed the completeness of these color magnitude diagrams here.
Yeah, I understand
and we get like 80%.
Yeah, but
level at 16
yes.
or so. So,
but even if
I
you're
would
complete,
say the red clump is really complete.
But even if you're complete, then assume the red clump is not symmetrically distributed about the galactic center. Do you have enough information in this data to try to leave the let's say the center of the red clump distribution free as a parameter?
That's a good question. I would say yes, I do, because what comes from modeling, we can discuss a little further later, but a short answer is that we think this disk is really old. It's about over 8 giga years old, given that the bar is over 8 giga years old, and that the time that stellar populations mixed here is really small. Like it only takes a few mega years in order to merge. So I wouldn't expect that much substructure in the nuclear stellar disk.
Yeah, that system is dynamically very old. So any transient perturbation you could have, it will have died down by now, I think. Okay, another question over there.
Have you compared your best extinction law with the one determined for the Arches cluster, which is not terribly far?
By Hosek, right? Is math by Hosek, I think is the.
I can't remember.
No, I don't.
But
I had it.
It
at
shouldn't
some
be
point.
too different.
I had it at some point in my to-do list, but I didn't add it. No, so it's a good one. Thank you.
Okay, there's another question over there. Here in the middle.
Hey, thank you for your talk. So you couldn't explain much about one of the last plots that you showed with the cyan points. Can you tell us a bit more about those points and how can that affect your extinction law?
Okay, so this is also really under investigation because if you look carefully, so there's the red clump, but there's like a secondary red clump here. It's like something below, and we're not sure what it is. Some people call it a secondary red clump. Other authors said that it's the RGB bump. And the issue is that if it is the RGB bump, it's pretty cool because the magnitude difference between the red clump and the RGB bump is a proxy for the metallicity of the stellar population. And we know these guys are really metal rich. So we know and the RGB bump, when the RGB bump is below the red clump, is because the population is metal rich, but we are not sure what it is. So yeah, I mean, we computed it. It has a slightly different slope here, but we're not sure what it is.
Okay, I think that we run out of time. Let's move on to the next talk.
Hello? Let's start. Well, hello everyone. I am Manuel Caveres, and I'm here to talk to you about my master's thesis project, which I've been working with, of course, not alone, with my supervisor, Professor Julio Chanamé, Camila Navarrete, Yasna Ordenes, and as you can see, the group is quite large. And the research title, An Experiment in Near-Field Cosmology, a Characterization of the Magellanic Wake. And I find it really great that we had your talk, Laporte, because it was a really nice introduction to this topic. So right now I don't really have to do that much of introduction. I can just skip through this part, but I will still show it because a lot of people have arrived through the different talks. So we call it an experiment in near-field cosmology because we're basically studying the distribution of the energy and the matter in the local group. And the really cool thing about near-field cosmology is that we work with individual stars. So we're not looking at integrated light. And one thing a lot of people do when they study a local group is, for example, do a simulation of the different satellites of the Milky Way. And to do this, you need to constrain two things: the mass of the Milky Way and the mass of the Large Magellanic Clouds, both of which are not really well constrained. The mass of the Milky Way can vary up to a factor of 2, and there's a lot of variation between different models that give different masses of the LMC. The other thing we are not really sure about is the dark matter distribution at large distances. There's a lot of different profiles, but there are not a lot of ways we can test this in this local group. And one thing we can do to test this is to look at the interactions in the system. And one particular interaction we want to look at is the Magellanic Wake. Here's a nice video provided by Nicolás Garavito of the same simulation you showed in your talk. Oh, so I think I have to do it very fast, I was told. Thank you. Yes. And you can see here that the Magellanic Wake is a result of dynamical friction between the galaxy and the Large Magellanic Clouds. In this simulation, you're looking at the density of dark matter, that basically this wake is this transient response that follows the path of the LMC orbit. And we expect it to translate into an overdensity in stellar content that could actually be observed. This actual wake will peak in density in the range between 60 and 100 kiloparsecs. So to observe it, we have to look very deep, hopefully use bright tracers. And there's actually already been a detection of this effect by Conroy. I'm going to sound repetitive to the previous talk. And he actually used K-giants to detect the Magellanic Wake in an all-sky approach using the Gaia DR3. And you can see that his distribution looks quite similar to the simulations by Nicolás Garavito, which is actually the one shown in the video. And then you can say, well, isn't the problem solved? And of course, as was mentioned before, we have problems with contamination that could occur here by substructure. And that the other problem is that K-giants are a very sparse tracer of the halo. So if you want to compare the density profiles between the simulations and your data, you're not going to have enough data points with K-giants to do this. So our approach is basically an observational approach. We have currently 4 completed fields that are aligned with declination 0. So they follow the ICRS coordinate system. And in these 4 points, we have one in the middle that is subject of a proposal that I still hope we will be able to observe in the future. And the actual data we collected in these 4 fields comes from the DECAM instruments as well as the VISTA instrument. With DECAM, we obtained the G and I bands, and with VISTA, the K short band. The cool thing about this data is that it's actually very deep. So it goes a magnitude deeper than the second data release of the Dark Energy Survey. And it goes well beyond most other near-infrared surveys that cover this area. And the specific reason why we had to go very deep is because we want to use better tracers than K-giants. We want to give a more statistically significant detection. And the reason we use this specific set of filters is because we were very worried about contamination by background galaxies. So as you go this deep towards the halo, you start that most of your point sources are actually just non-resolved galaxies. And the way we deal with it is usually by color selections. And the particular color selection we were using is what I call the GIKS color diagram, which people who work in extragalactic astrophysics are very familiar with. And you can see here a lot of distinct features that they use, like the ability to select star-forming galaxies, passive galaxies, high metallicity single star populations that are not resolved. And what we're particularly interested in is selecting the stellar locus here. And the cool thing is that this specific space of color allows you to select main sequence turn-off stars quite easily, as most of the turn-offs of reasonably halo-like populations will lie in the same point around here. You can also select different traces like VHV or blue star stars, or the other tracer we used, which are RGV stars. And here, just to contrast it, here's one star galaxy separation method that's usually used with the dark energy survey bands, using the I, GI, and Z bands. And you can see that the galaxies most likely lie below the stellar locus in this point, in this diagram. And here's our selection where we get a very nice separation. So we can be very confident that our selection of stars is quite clean with this method. And here you can see the colored magnitude diagrams of all the point sources compared to the sources we removed with this method that basically, thank you, cover most of the space, and of the sources we're going to be using for a study, which are the stars. And yeah, point to the depths we get, we are going very deep. And with this clean selection of stars, we selected, as I mentioned before, 2 tracers. We selected Nightmare sequence turn-off stars, as well as red giant branch stars. And for the sake of time, I will skip through the selection process. Maybe you can ask me later. And using those 2 tracers, we computed photometric distances to select a sample between 60 and 100 kiloparsecs. With that, we can now compare our slice, our fields, going from the one farthest to the current detection by Conroy to the one that's actually near the middle of the overdensity that was found by Conroy, to simulations here on the right, simulations by Garavito Camargo of this interaction between the LMC and the halo of the Milky Way. One thing to note is why I asked the question in one of the previous talks is that these simulations show mostly dark matter content. So here we are showing how the dark matter content that's actually weight relates to the stellar content. And we find a steeper slope compared to the simulations using 2 different masses of the LMC. And the other thing we were very worried about was actually, what if we are just looking at substructure in the halo? So I compared with all the halos of Bullock and Johnston. I also checked that we had no galactic streams anywhere nearby our fields. And here on the left, you can see a comparison between our data points for the 4 fields we have for the 2 different tracers, and all of the simulations of all of the halos of Bullock and Johnston with 1 sigma deviation of the different bins sliced in the same way as our fields. And the other cool thing we found is that this effect can not only be seen in terms of a spatial density profile, but also as a radial density profile. So here we're taking slices from the center of the galaxy outwards and comparing it here with only 1 simulation by Nicolás Garavito of 2.5 times 10 to the 11 solar masses of the LMC. And you can see as we go from tile 1 that we get a very good agreement between both the simulation, our data, and the radial density profile of a triaxial halo. And then as we move towards tiles that are closer and closer to the overdensity, mainly tile 4, which is the one that's near the middle of the overdensity as detected by Conroy, and as with the data points we have, we find that our distribution of stars almost closely resembles that of the simulation, and basically diverges a lot from the triaxial model. And of course, at larger distances, we have completeness issues. And just to conclude, I have the ability say we have obtained a statistically significant detection of the Magellanic Wave, which is in good agreement with the simulation and in actually better agreement with the observations by Conroy. We can claim that we have the first detection of the wake in line of sight, and we also detected it in the spatial density profiles. And what I want to do now is compare with different dark matter models, basically different profiles of the dark matter, having a lot more simulations, just with a lot more masses of the LMC. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. This contribution is now open to questions. There's one over here. Anthony?
Thanks, very nice work. If you go back to the plot where you show these, yeah, this one. In principle, the Bullock and Johnston simulations allow for what you observe, right? So what gives you confidence that it's not due to substructure?
Yes, so the Bullock and Johnston simulation have like very steep substructure that could be the result of this. The thing that gives me some confidence is that it is quite unlikely to find it. And the size of the substructure would indicate that we have, for example, one specific tile that's actually larger than the other. However, we see a kind of linear almost relationship between all the different tiles, which is not really characteristic of substructure.
Yeah, I mean, but that's something that maybe you could try to quantify because you have the information from the simulations. You could try to see what's the chance that you would get some alignment like that just from substructure. And,
yes, I believe it would be an actually good thing to test it.
Yeah, just to get.
So I tested with all the 14 halos. Here I included like 3 line of sights because they're not preferably line of sight in the Bullock and Johnston halos. So yes, I could compute the likelihood of falling between some substructure. But yeah, it's some work in progress that we still have to deal with, seeing if we are just looking at substructure.
Okay, there's another question here on the left.
Very nice talk. Thanks for that. I was wondering about, you mentioned contamination from background galaxies. Was wondering about stellar streams. I don't know, Gaia Enceladus, all these streams that we saw that are in the Milky Way halo. How do you do the separation? How do you intend to do that?
There are currently not many known stellar streams between 60 and 100 kiloparsecs of distance from the galactic center. So by looking at the Gulf Stream library, for example, I couldn't find any that was nearby by a reasonable amount, even if I stretch them through the entire sky, and within the same range of distances. So, of course, we don't know the entirety of the outer halo. We might have to wait for LSST and the combination of Euclid we can basically do this same thing with LSST and Euclid. We get the same bands to know it for sure. But yeah, with the current knowledge, we can be sure-ish that we don't see any streams.
Okay, even Gaia Enceladus, that's...
No, yes, even Gaia Enceladus, we don't know, but it might be closer by, I think, Gaia Enceladus, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's hard.
Okay.
But it's good.
Yes, there's a question here in the front. Shervin?
Hi, could you go back to that slide where you had the green and red lines as a function of like angle, I think? Yeah, this one. So you were saying that, yeah, this is just dark matter contribution, but you know, in the simulation, at least like in the 2019 paper, what we did is that we did actually simulate also like a stellar halo. Did you try, for example, changing like because for example, what you can measure in the stellar halo of the Milky Way is like the spherical density profile of the Milky Way stellar halo. Did you try to, for example, like reproducing that inside the dark matter only simulation, generate the weights, and then plot the line? Because if this is the line of like overdensity for just the dark matter, that's one possible prediction of the simulation. But you could think of other things as well by basically changing, creating distribution functions for a stellar halo. Doesn't matter, like smooth, whatever, but still changing the density profile and see how much leg room you have to bump up your signal, for example? Do you try that?
Yeah, I actually tried getting a hold of the data to do that. I wrote like 5 emails to Nicolas Garavito, but I'm still waiting for the response to that.
Okay, well,
but he
I'll
provided the
WhatsApp him.
snapshots for this. He provided me with the snapshots I used to construct this, but I don't have all of the set of the simulations you used.
No, because I mean we have the code, so we can just give it to you. You can just play with it.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Okay, very good. Let's thank Manuel again.
Thank you.